Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Editor's Note, and today we have yet another very interesting guest, namely Professor Russel Berman, who is a director of the Working Group for the Middle East and Islamic World at the Hoover Institute, and also a formerly senior advisor at the policy planning staff at the State Department in the U.S. It's very good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You're currently part of a delegation visiting Israel as part of, or TV7 is hosting this delegation, and I'd like to ask to your perspective as to your experience. You've already traveled southward. We still have a very long itinerary in front of us. Nonetheless, it was quite the shocking part of this trip, rather than the strategic discussions that are, of course, ensuing during this week.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for having me. As interesting as the many discussions I've been able to have here have been, it's a difficult trip. I've been to Israel many times before. Wonderful country, beautiful country, remarkable country. But it's a very, very somber time now after October 7th. Yesterday we visited Kfar Aza, one of the kibbutzim that was so brutally attacked on October 7th. We saw the destruction, the burnt buildings, the devastation of the location that stands in such stark contrast to what one could see as the beauty of the environment there. After that, we saw the film of the atrocities, the film that the killers themselves made, also dash cams from cars and other sources. And I have to say, I've never seen anything like this before. Humans can do terrible things to humans. Of course, this was not Shoah, but it is the kind of brutality that one sees in ethnic wars. Probably saw something like this in the Yugoslav wars or in Rwanda genocide, excuse me. But comparisons are beside the point. Seeing the bloodlust, the hate, the willingness of these young men to kill innocent people, they see a father run into a shelter with his two sons and throw a hand grenade in after him, shooting a dog, and then taking the dead bodies back into Gaza, and the crowd just kicking the bodies, kicking the corpses, and shouting Allahu Akbar. That sends a message, I suppose, to at least their perception of what God wants. The scene of one of these young men cutting off the head of a corpse. What we saw was evil. What we saw was the presence of real evil in the world. And it is not going to be an easy problem to solve for policymakers as to how do you organize a security system, how do you organize an international system in which it's not really about border dispute here or there. It's not really about tax structure here or there. It's about facing evil and an evil that wants to destroy you. I can understand that the Israeli public opinion can only insist on defeating this enemy completely.
You're a professor at Stanford, and I would like to get your perspective about the situation in campuses in the U.S., in Europe, and other locations as well, including Ivy League schools, which have access to firsthand experiences. They do have those funds in order to send them abroad and experience matters firsthand. Where's the disconnect with what currently is seen on campuses and the reality that you saw on that video? Where did they misinterpret it in relation to reality in those campuses?
After October 7th, and even before the Israeli response began, we saw an upswing of expressions of anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses, but not only anti-Semitism, but endorsement of the violence of the killers in the kibbutzim. There was one Cornell professor who was quoted as saying that he felt exhilaration. Other professors at Columbia and elsewhere made similar statements. The slogans of the students included by any means necessary. That is to say, they believe that there's a legitimate political goal. I'm not quite sure what that is, but they believe this is a legitimate political goal. And to achieve that goal, any means are appropriate. That is to say, the end justifies the means. That is to say, there are no ethical constraints on what one might do in order to achieve a goal. This is appalling.
In institutions that their role above educating the individuals is also relaying the ethics and the legal structures of what humanity created?
That's an interesting perspective. Some might believe that higher education could convey, should convey, must convey ethical values in addition to technical knowledge. I believe that most faculty would disagree with that. Most faculty believe that they should convey expertise in their field and refrain from conveying, I'll call it wisdom about life or the distinction between good and bad. At the same time, however, many of the same faculty are quite comfortable with promoting their political ideological views inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So there's a bit of a tension between that. There's a mobilization of students and some faculty around a very simplistic oppressor-oppressed ideology. In some parts of humanity are designated oppressors, the others are the oppressed, and the oppressed are therefore able to do whatever they want by any means necessary, including rape, burning, decapitation, in order to achieve what these deluded individuals imagine to be emancipation. This is terrible. I think, and not only I, but
that is no less evil than those acting.
Yeah, we need to have a fundamental change in the character of what goes on in universities to disallow this solidarity with evil. And this would require different kinds of leadership. It would require university presidents, provosts, deans to, frankly, be more directive in what goes on inside the university. We're not going to abolish tenure. That's not going to happen. We're not going to abolish academic freedom. Also not going to happen. And neither of those things should happen. But the president, the provost, the deans can have a significant influence in terms of who gets hired, who is kept, and what gets taught. And so far, well, at this point, many of those university administrators are really just looking out for their careers and want to avoid conflict. But in a world of evil, choosing to avoid conflict is really capitulation to evil.
Well, let's turn to another point derived out of this, and that is, to what degree do these campuses and the various anti-Semitism arising out of those impact foreign policy?
Immediately, not a lot. In the long run, they might, because the 20-year-old who is declaring his or her solidarity with the terrorists might, in 20 years, work in government. One hopes that maybe the 20-year-old at 25 will be a little wiser, and 30 and 35, and people grow up. There is something about youthful foolishness that is going on. Nonetheless, one has to worry about the transformation of political consensus as these groups make their way through the institutions. The foreign policy world is itself not unanimous in the United States. Of course, there's a lot of support for Israel. It's a question about how deep that support is, how far that support goes. We do face a certain amount of isolationism on the far left and on the far right. I think they're both misguided, and I don't want to have to choose one over the other because they're both wrong. But one has to continue to engage in the foreign policy world and push back against those who would accommodate evil.
Let's turn to the U.S. alliance and policy vis-a-vis Europe and Israel in this triangle. What comes to mind when you identify the various complexities, issues that you've been working on at the foreign policy staff?
Yeah. A few points. I think from an American point, well, from an Israeli point of view, the issue is security for the state of Israel in a tough neighborhood. From an American point of view, Israel's an ally, and we want Israel to be secure, but the United States is engaged in a global struggle with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They impact Israel, but the U.S. engagement in that struggle is obviously a different one than for the small state of Israel. Europe is an important piece in this jigsaw puzzle. Europe has been asleep for too long, but the Ukraine war may have woken it up to the need for it to contribute more to its own defense, to its own security. It's still not doing enough, but it's doing more than it has in the past. President Trump pushed very hard on Europe to contribute more toward defense, to meet its Wales pledge in NATO, and to wean itself from dependency on Russian energy. The European elite sneered at him. Then the Ukraine war happened, and it turns out that he was right on all these points.
Which many European leaders do acknowledge today.
Well, yeah, better late than never, right? But Trump was right and Biden was wrong.
Right.
On Nord Stream, on NATO spending, and frankly, on that list should be the whole question of where U.S. troops are. We don't need U.S. troops in Germany to protect the Oktoberfest. We need troops on the eastern flank to prevent a Russian invasion. If Ukraine should lose, the Baltics are not safe. No. And I don't think, and while the United States may come to the support of NATO allies in such a situation, I'm not fully convinced that the rest of the Europeans will. Not the French, not the Spanish. Frankly, I worry about the Germans too. It also, of course, depends in all of these countries on what the composition of the government is. And there's an extraordinary amount of internal political stability in those European countries, in part as a function of immigration from the Middle East.
Indeed. When you're looking at the current situation vis-a-vis Iran, particularly, considering the fact that what Ukraine is for Russia, Iraq is for Iran, and the Iranians have time and again highlighted their aspirations to oust the United States, which is ultimately its major stumbling block to regain full control over what used to be the Persian Empire in the boundaries of those two countries. What do you identify there? Is there something that should be done in order to somehow push back? And is the Biden administration currently doing enough?
The Biden administration is doing nothing on this. That's a whole other very sad story. We will see now if the Biden administration will respond to the attacks in Jordan just a few days ago. This is the test. Does he have mettle or not? He may lose the election on the character of his response to that. But the bigger picture is, yes, Iran wants to push the United States out of the Middle East, just like Russia wants to push the United States out of Europe. This is the long-standing Russian dream. And just like China wants to push the United States out of the Western Pacific. That's the American perspective, which is consistent with, but of course much larger than the Israeli perspective on what's going on right now. We need to have a foreign policy posture that projects strength and a willingness to push back against aggression. We haven't had that for several years. The way the Biden administration left Afghanistan and effectively his endorsement for the humiliation that took place sent a signal that the United States could be pushed around. And Russia and Iran and China are all acting on that, acting frankly rationally. If they believe that the United States is a pushover, a paper tiger, as Mao used to say, then they're going to try to push forward. I think we're in a very, very dangerous time now between this January and next January, when we might have a different president, and our enemies are going to want to take advantage of this window of opportunity.
Let's talk about BRICS, if we may, considering the fact that we see that Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa are looking to expand to additional countries. And ironically, South Africa has been bolstering its attempts to dissuade other countries from not necessarily engaging with Western alliances, but to seek more of a Southern Hemisphere, Southern world, if I may call that, rebellion against the Northern world or the Western world in that sense. Are there concerns about this evolving in a factor that may indeed challenge Western civilization to the degree that could not only contest, but also really hamper on efforts to grow and improve in sectors of civic society?
Of course, the United States and the West should pay more attention to the BRICS, to the, I don't like the term, the global South.
I try to avoid that term, yeah.
But this doesn't mean conceding. This doesn't mean signing up for their ideology. What it is really is a recycled third worldism of 50 years ago. Now, important would be to develop foreign policy focus and intentionality in engaging with the different countries there who have, in fact, different interests. Russia, China are trying to corral them into around a common denominator, but that common denominator doesn't really map onto their distinct national interests. And one lesson of the current era is that for all the talk of globalism, for all the talk of universalism, nations have their national interests and they will pursue them. And if the United States can make it clear to India that it is better served through an alliance with the United States, then as part of the BRICS club, India is going to see the light. Some in India may, probably members of the old Congress Party, want to see it as part of the global South, but India has an adversarial relationship with China, and therefore India is a natural ally for the United States. India, I believe, is frankly a natural member of an expanded security architecture that would come up through the Gulf and include Saudi Arabia and Israel eventually. I think that kind of regional structure that involves Israel and the Sunni states is objectively right, and it was almost achieved, then it was interrupted, but it is going to happen eventually. That's the goal. A precondition for that security structure where India and the Sunni states, the Sunni Gulf states, are aligned is Israel's demonstration of its strength in defeating Hamas.
Very interesting indeed. Let's take it one step forward, though, since we're seeing Foreign Minister Jaishankar speak time and again about the challenges between Europe and India, and while not particularly articulating that vis-a-vis the United States, it seems like India is demanding respect, something that obviously may be well placed in certain areas, and therefore, to what degree or how would you translate that into practical matters?
All countries deserve respect, or all countries that behave in a respectful manner deserve respect. Some countries behave reprehensibly. But India is a great country, heir to a great civilization that has lots to share objectively with the West and with the United States in particular. We need to build on that. I believe the diplomacy of the United States has in the past paid insufficient attention to countries of Africa and to India. President Trump actually had interest in developing a robust Latin America foreign policy, unlike his predecessors. So yes, the world is global, but it's global in the sense of made up of a network of nations with national interests engaged in bilateral relations.
Basing everything on the Westphalia treaties of 1648, or
sovereign states. States. Right. Having a sovereign state is important.
Indeed. We don't have very much time left, but nonetheless, I'd like to touch on strategic power competition and how do other allies and partners of the United States fall within that category. Since a month into the transition, when the Biden administration assumed office, it held a meeting in Alaska at the time with Wang Yi, the state counselor of China. Antony Blinken was there, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor. And within that discussion, China highlighted to their American counterparts, we are pure nations, and let the games begin, so-called. How do you see the U.S. operate within that sphere and reassure its allies and partners that do have transactional relations with China, so does the United States, operate within the limitations and constraints that do not allow the so-called strategic power competition to alter the equation in China's favor?
Well, you know, of course, that there's this discussion about the difference between decoupling and de-risking. Right. In the gray space between those two poles, there's an opportunity to limit a nation's vulnerability to the malign efforts on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. China is an enormous country. It's an enormous economy. One can't wish it away. It's going to remain there. It's going to remain a.
I don't think anybody wants to wish it away, for that matter.
But one has to be clear-headed about what kind of supply chain dependency one wants to have on China. One has to be clear-headed about what kind of intellectual property expectations one can have there. Nothing in this debate, nothing in this discussion is anti-Chinese. All problems with China would be solved if China had a multi-party system and an independent judiciary. The recent finding of the Hong Kong court against the Chinese real estate firm it will be an interesting case to see whether the Hong Kong court's ruling will hold in mainland China. Mainland China claims Hong Kong as part of it. Now we'll see. Does that work in two directions? So the United States and the West are going to have to engage in economic statecraft with China to develop strategies that make us safe, so we are not subject to blackmail because we're dependent on certain product or certain raw materials that China controls. We have to think about the whole electric car discussion in that context. The shift to green energy, to the green transition, may have an environmentalist logic to it, but it can't mean subordination to Chinese monopolization of certain raw materials?
In the long term, yes. In the short term, I'm not so sure. According to a number of scientists that I've had deliberations with who are official government scientists, their recommendations are not usually accepted, at least not in Europe, due to political considerations of coalitions and other things that the United States doesn't have necessarily to contend with.
Yes, agreed. That's one can have a debate about the environmentalist claim altogether. But my point is that just as Europe should not have made itself dependent on Russian energy, the United States should not make itself dependent on Chinese rare earths.
Agreed. Same goes for for Russia, excuse me, and same goes for Qatar, for that matter. When we're talking about LNG, but in broad terms, we don't have very much time. I think one of the main issues, and this is a distinction that I make, is that the Chinese Central or Communist Party in China views China as its property, and therefore its interests supersede those of China. And its constitution in China highlights that any governmental organization or private organization is subject to the party, and therefore it utilizes means that are not accepted or even frowned upon in Western civilization. And there is a clear disconnect between West and East, North and South as well, but we'll have to leave that for another opportunity. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Russel Berman.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. The Middle East, home to the cradle of civilization, retains a reputation from time immemorial as one of the most complex, conflict-ridden regions of the world. A cluster of nations, religions, powers, and influences, Mideast intricacies pose conundrums to even the most astute individuals. Bombarded daily, indeed every minute, by a barrage of information, some accurate, yet most of it less so, TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of who partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio every Tuesdays and Fridays for content that truly matters. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.